For most of my life, I've lived with a quiet sense of uncertainty about myself. It was never about my gender identity. I've always identified as male and felt settled in that. What troubled me instead was my strong connection to traits commonly labeled as feminine, a side of myself I learned early on to hide. Society made it clear what was acceptable. Girls could step into traditionally masculine roles without much pushback, but boys who showed anything considered feminine were quickly mocked or dismissed. Over time, I stumbled upon the concept of crossdressing and began to explore it whenever I had the chance. When I was home alone, I would quietly try on my mother's clothes. I was never caught outright, but looking back, I suspect my parents knew. I left enough small clues that it would have been difficult to miss, and they chose silence instead of confrontation. As I grew older, this exploration shifted in meaning. What began as curiosity and comfort slowly took on a more fantasy-driven role. I never believed I could convincingly present as female, but wearing women's clothing gave me a sense of ease, and I sometimes imagined myself stepping into a more traditionally feminine role within intimate scenarios. This was confusing, especially since I identified as straight. I wasn't attracted to men, though I could admit, half-jokingly, that a very specific celebrity exception might make me question that certainty. Forming relationships was never easy for me. Anxiety and other psychological struggles made opening up feel risky, and approaching potential partners felt almost impossible. I did have one serious relationship, largely because she took the initiative. I had gone to her dorm room to help fix her computer, and afterward she sat on my lap and kissed me. That moment turned into a relationship that lasted nearly 2 years. In the end, though, she cheated on me. It wasn't the first time. It had happened once before, and we had tried to move past it, but the second betrayal closed the door completely. During that relationship, we attended a costume party where I dressed as a cheerleader and she went as a football player. By then, she knew about my interest in cross-dressing, having discovered it through my internet history. She was mostly accepting, but it was clear she preferred a more conventional, traditionally masculine partner. I often felt like I was playing a secondary role, never quite measuring up to what she truly wanted. After that, there was a long stretch, nearly 15 years, without another serious relationship. Somewhere along the way, I began to understand what I actually wanted, even though I had no idea how to get there. What resonated with me was the idea of a female-led relationship. I had come across stories centered on feminine authority and leadership before, but I had always treated them as pure fiction. Stories were just stories, or so I thought. As I looked more closely, I realized I had no clear path for turning those ideas into something real. I joined online forums and groups focused on female-led dynamics and consensual power exchange, hoping for clarity. Instead, I found myself even more unsure of how to move forward. Eventually, I came across the website of a local professional who specialized in dominance-based services, offered only after a brief screening process. She made it clear that everything she provided was non-intimate and carefully structured to comply with local laws. Despite how difficult it had always been for me to approach women, I found myself writing an email to her. I justified it by telling myself that reaching out in this context felt more achievable than trying to navigate dating the usual way. After several messages back and forth, we agreed to meet for lunch at a nearby restaurant. She reassured me that the meeting would simply be an open, judgment-free conversation, an opportunity for honesty and discussion before deciding on anything further. I was instructed to arrive early, dress neatly, no casual shoes, hats, t-shirts, or jeans, and request a booth. I was also asked to leave a note with the hostess, so she could be guided to my table when she arrived. Sitting there alone, waiting, my nerves were frayed. I kept wondering what might happen, or whether I should leave before she showed up. I had brought an envelope with a consultation fee inside, including a non-refundable deposit, but doubts kept circling in my head. Was everything truly legal? Where exactly did the boundaries of the law lie? I watched the entrance repeatedly, already knowing what she looked like from her website photos and our messages. When she finally arrived, about 15 or 20 minutes late, which didn't really bother me, I saw her speak briefly with the hostess before being led over. When she sat down across from me, I felt my breath catch. She was striking, around my age, with vivid red hair cut just past her shoulders. She asked for my name, and I confirmed both hers and mine, choosing not to use any titles out of caution, mindful of the people seated nearby. We ordered drinks, both opting for non-alcoholic choices, and ended up choosing the same dessert, a generous slice of carrot cake she enthusiastically recommended. As we ate, the conversation began to flow. We talked about our backgrounds, my long struggle with dating, and how hard it had always been for me to approach women. At one point, she smiled over her coffee, slowly stirring in sugar, and remarked that I clearly was capable of reaching out. She was right. I had contacted her after all. But even then, it felt very different from trying to approach someone in the ordinary world. I told her that I had no prior experience with BDSM or dominance and submission dynamics, but that I was curious and open to learning. She smiled and said she enjoyed working with people who were new to it. I explained that many of my fantasies revolved around feminization and crossdressing, and that I was also interested in exploring masochism, though I wasn't sure how much discomfort I could realistically tolerate. I also disclosed that I had a mild seizure condition, clarifying that it involved brief moments of disorientation rather than full convulsions, and that it had never posed a serious issue. She listened carefully and said she would take everything into account, adding that we could proceed only in ways I felt comfortable with. Later that evening, we continued the discussion by email and scheduled a time for the session. She sent me the next set of instructions. Since it wasn't practical for her to keep clothing in every possible size, she explained that I would need to bring my own outfit. She could supply wigs, makeup, and accessories, but I was responsible for undergarments, a dress or skirt, and shoes, preferably with a lower heel if I planned on moving around much. She also suggested that I groom as much body hair as I felt comfortable with, especially if I wanted a more polished look. With a light, teasing tone, she added that thrift stores were the easiest place to find what I needed, joking that Goodwill was practically made for situations like this. I spent a lot of time at home trying to figure out women's clothing sizes. Shoe sizes and chest measurements were fairly easy to translate, but dresses were another story. The sizing seemed inconsistent, and without the same proportions as a woman, I couldn't make sense of how the numbers were supposed to work. I went to Goodwill with my measurements, but despite my efforts, I couldn't find anything that felt right. Pieces that should have worked on paper were either too loose in some places or too tight in others. I had been excited about buying everything in person, as she suggested, partly for the experience itself. In the end, though, I ordered most of the clothing online after doing more research on sizing. I managed to find a dress and shoes that seemed promising. Finding women's shoes in my size and wide enough was especially difficult. I also stopped by a department store to pick up undergarments and hosiery, relying on self-checkout to avoid any awkward interactions. The dress I chose was a simple but attractive midi style, complete with a belt I didn't really need. It seemed to fit reasonably well, though I couldn't be completely sure since I struggled to zip it up by myself. I opted for slip-on stockings rather than full pantyhose, as they felt more comfortable to me. I already owned a specialty bra and chest forms, which I had worn privately before, though never out in public. I liked the way they made me feel, even if they stayed hidden. With about a week to go before the session, I decided to take care of grooming ahead of time so there wouldn't be any irritation or last-minute issues. I used a depilatory cream she had recommended, which worked well on sensitive areas. I removed as much hair as I reasonably could from my neck down, leaving a few hard-to-reach spots alone. It had been a while since I'd done this kind of upkeep. I used to do it occasionally when dressing up, but not on a regular basis. Afterward, I made a point of moisturizing and maintaining the results with light touch-ups every couple of days. When the day of the session arrived, it was scheduled for 3 p.m., and I spent the entire day on edge. I had taken time off work, and the mix of anticipation and anxiety was almost overwhelming. A part of me kept whispering worst-case scenarios, that something could go wrong, or that I might be walking into a scam or some kind of trouble. Still, I reminded myself that the amount of detailed communication we'd exchanged made it seem unlikely that this was anything other than what she said it was. About 20 minutes before I was supposed to leave for her space, which she described as being in a converted old church in a quiet neighborhood. I did a final round of preparation and packed my clothes and accessories into a reusable grocery bag. I was still nervous, but I had committed to seeing it through. I arrived in the area about 15 minutes early, careful not to be too early. I drove around briefly, then parked in the driveway and noticed there were no other cars nearby. Her instructions were specific. I was to enter through the front door, place my payment in a box near the entryway, remove my shoes, and sit on a bench to wait. I wasn't to call out or wander on my own. Everything was to proceed at her pace, with clear respect for boundaries. I walked up to the door, tried the latch, and found it locked. Unsure what to do, I simply waited outside on the porch. From the outside, the building looked like an ordinary house on a calm residential street, though certain details hinted at its past and present use, like the Victorian-style patio furniture and distinctive paint colors. A few minutes later, another car pulled up and parked in front. Through the window, I recognized her. She greeted me cheerfully by name as she approached the door to unlock it. She explained that she was running a bit late because of a lunch meeting and had tried to text me, but the message hadn't gone through, either because of a wrong number or a phone issue. She was still immediately striking to me, her vivid red hair impossible to ignore. She wore a fashionable skirt that fell well above the knee, dark tights, and an elegant blouse that suited her perfectly. We stepped into the entryway of the converted church, and she locked the door behind us. She told me she'd need a few minutes to prepare, then disappeared behind the curtains that separated the foyer from the main room. I followed the instructions I'd been given earlier. I took out the envelope containing her payment and placed it in the designated box, removed my shoes, and sat down to wait. From behind the curtains, I could hear her moving around, heels tapping against the floor, drawers opening and closing, and music playing softly from a radio she turned on. While I waited, my eyes wandered to a glass cabinet nearby that held an assortment of old, curious objects, some of them clearly relics from another era. I had no idea how much time passed. My heart was pounding, my nerves stretched thin, and my thoughts kept circling the same worries. I clutched the handle of my shopping bag, grounding myself. Then I heard her footsteps again, this time approaching. She stepped through the curtain and stopped in front of me. She had added a structured corset-like piece over her outfit, which gave her an even more commanding presence. She placed her hands on her hips, raised an eyebrow slightly, and asked if I was ready. I nodded and answered quietly that I was still tense and unsure of myself. She turned and led the way through the curtain into the main room. The sanctuary had been completely transformed. The pews were gone, replaced by ornate couches lining one wall. The opposite side held various pieces of equipment clearly intended for role-play and theatrical restraint, arranged neatly rather than chaotically. In one corner, a small kitchenette had been installed, and at the front of the room stood a raised platform with an imposing chair and a kneeler position before it. She took the bag from my hand and asked if it contained what I'd brought. I confirmed that it did. She then instructed me to go to a nearby bathroom, change, and return to kneel and wait, whether she was present or not. Her voice was calm but authoritative, leaving no doubt that she expected to be obeyed. I acknowledged her instruction and went into the bathroom, my hands trembling slightly as I undressed. I've never been fully comfortable with my body, and exposing myself, even in a controlled, professional setting, brought back old insecurities. Still, I reminded myself that this was something I had chosen, and that she had been clear and respectful throughout our communication. Once I was done, I folded my clothes neatly, opened the door, and stepped back out, setting them on a nearby bench. She was already seated in the large chair, facing forward, only briefly acknowledging my presence as I approached. I knelt where I was directed. She gave a small approving smile and asked me to show her what I had brought. I opened the bag and carefully laid out each item: the dress, hosiery, undergarments, shoes, and the specialty pieces I'd mentioned earlier. She examined them with interest, picking a few up to inspect more closely before setting them aside again. Her expression shifted to something more serious, and she instructed me to lower my gaze. I did as told. She reminded me that this session was about structure, attention, and following direction, and asked if I understood. I confirmed that I did. She stood, took my hand, and guided me toward the center of the room where most of the equipment was arranged. When I instinctively looked up, she immediately corrected me, reminding me not to meet her eyes unless given permission. I lowered my head again, feeling acutely aware of every movement. She positioned me carefully, giving clear instructions for where to stand and how to hold my arms. I followed each one. She briefly stepped away and returned with restraint cuffs designed for comfort and safety rather than force. She secured them in place and activated a mechanism that adjusted my posture, lifting my arms overhead in a controlled, non-painful way. She asked me a routine question about my health, then nodded, apparently satisfied with the answer. Returning to her role, she marked a few areas on my skin with a cosmetic pencil, explaining that it was purely symbolic, part of the ritual and mindset of the session. She then placed a soft collar around my neck, another visual reminder of the dynamic we'd agreed upon. She told me she was going to conduct a careful inspection and asked for my acknowledgement. I responded affirmatively, though I briefly forgot myself and looked up. She corrected me immediately, firmer this time, reinforcing the boundary. To help me focus and prevent further distraction, she gently covered my eyes with one of the items I'd brought, turning my attention inward rather than outward. With my vision blocked, I became much more aware of her presence as she moved around me. She checked my posture, adjusted my position, and asked calm, practical questions about a few physical details she noticed. When she pointed out a couple of irregularities on my thighs, I explained that they were harmless and had been medically evaluated before. She acknowledged this and continued, professional and attentive, maintaining control of the situation without judgment. She also asked about my anatomy. I explained that I'd had a medical condition as a child that required corrective surgery, and while everything functioned normally, things weren't positioned in a typical way. She acknowledged this calmly, then commented on how thoroughly groomed I was, my chest, underarms, legs, and overall appearance. She said I'd done a very good job. I thanked her and explained that I'd used a depilatory cream along with regular shaving, though I hadn't been able to reach my back or a few awkward areas. I apologized for that. She waved it off and said I'd done better than most of the people she worked with. She then remarked on how reactive my body was, noting it as a sign of heightened sensitivity. A faint metallic sound followed, and she asked me about my tolerance for discomfort. I told her I believed I could handle a fair amount, depending on the circumstances. I caught a brief glimpse of what she was preparing through the edge of the blindfold. I had braced myself, expecting discomfort, but what followed was sharper and more intense than I'd anticipated. It wasn't unbearable at first, but the sensation was constant and difficult to ignore. I found myself wondering whether this was normal or whether I was simply more sensitive than I'd realized. She continued her assessment, occasionally giving light corrective taps as part of the experience, then asked how I was feeling. I must have looked unsteady, because I could feel the onset of lightheadedness, a thin sheen of sweat forming on my forehead. I admitted that the sensation was more than I could manage. She responded immediately, removed what she'd applied, and gave me space. I heard the mechanism adjust, felt my arms released, and she guided me forward, instructing me to kneel. Once I did, she removed the blindfold and told me to look at her. Her expression softened, and she guided me into a bowed position, encouraging slow, steady breathing until I felt more grounded. She stepped away briefly and returned with drinks, offering them without urgency. I took one and drank slowly while she reminded me to stay relaxed. After a moment, she asked me to kneel comfortably again. She pulled over a chair, sat down, and rested her feet lightly against me, using me as support. She asked whether I'd heard of the concept of human furniture. I told her I'd read about it in passing. She explained the idea in a casual, almost conversational way, describing how it could shift a person's focus from self-consciousness to stillness and usefulness. She asked whether I thought that kind of role would appeal to me. I said that it did. She checked in again, asking how I felt. I told her I was doing better. She leaned forward slightly, giving a reassuring pat, then said she needed to tend to a few things. She asked if I could remove her shoes. They were stylish, ankle-high heels. My hands fumbled with the small buckles at first, part nerves, part clumsiness, but I managed. She then asked for a simple foot massage. I did my best, unsure of my technique, but focused on following her lead. After a short while, she told me that was enough and said we would move on. She returned with a small bottle of nail polish and demonstrated how to apply it using one finger, as an example. She then had me finish the rest. When I was done, she said I'd done well and told me I'd earned the next step, getting dressed. She brought over my clothing and helped me put everything on properly, adjusting the fit with practiced ease. After making a few final adjustments, she stepped back and offered a compliment. By this point, some of the earlier strictness had softened. She helped fasten my dress, added an accessory to keep the stockings secure, and looked me over with an appraising eye before saying I looked quite presentable. She showed me how to take a few careful steps in the heels. I wobbled, but she reassured me that it would come with practice. She seated me on a stool, opened her makeup kit, and began working methodically. As she did, we talked, light conversation at first, then gradually more personal topics. She asked about my upbringing and what had brought me there. I found myself answering honestly, more openly than I ever had with a woman before. When she finished, she handed me a wig and helped me stand. I looked in the mirror. The overall effect was polished, the outfit coordinated, the makeup balanced, the hair natural-looking, even if I could still clearly recognize myself beneath it all. I accepted her compliments, knowing I looked as put together as I reasonably could. I did notice, though, that my legs looked especially good in the stockings. Earlier, we talked about hair, and I'd mentioned my fondness for red hair, complimenting hers in particular. As we stood there, she suddenly seemed inspired and disappeared upstairs. She returned with a different wig, this one a reddish tone. She told me it was a personal item she didn't usually use, but that she was making an exception. She placed it on me, adjusted it carefully, and then asked if she could take a few photos. Without thinking it through, I agreed. She took several pictures in different spots around the room, directing me into various seated and relaxed poses, including on one of the ornate couches. In one photo, she adjusted my outfit slightly to highlight the styling details, then stepped back to review her work. She continued guiding me how to walk, how to sit, even how to carry myself when speaking. At times, her tone shifted into something casual and friendly, almost like we were close companions. She joked that we should go shopping together someday so I could build a proper wardrobe and find a wig of my own, adding that she knew places where no one would pay any attention or judge. She even teased that I wouldn't have to pay her for that. With a playful look, she asked whether I would dress up for her if we went shopping together. I hesitated and admitted that I wasn't sure I'd feel comfortable doing that. She responded with an exaggerated pout, clearly teasing rather than pressuring. At one point, she had me lie back on an ottoman and remarked that it was usually where she disciplined people, but since I'd been well-behaved, she wouldn't be doing that. As I rested there, she adjusted my posture and ran her hands reassuringly along my back and hips, correcting how I held myself. She stepped back afterward and commented on how feminine the overall presentation looked, though she noted that a bit of remaining body hair slightly disrupted the effect. After more conversation, walking practice, and photos, she told me it was time to change back into my regular clothes. She added, half-jokingly, that she might try to convince me to leave dressed as I was. I declined again, politely but firmly, saying I wasn't ready for that. She gave another playful pout and led me to the bathroom, where she laid out makeup remover and cleansing cream. She instructed me to clean up, change, and return when I was ready. I followed her directions. Once I was back in my everyday clothes and everything was packed away, I returned to the main room. She smiled, took my hands, and told me to spend the next few days reflecting on the experience, how it felt, what stood out, and whether I might want to explore anything further in the future. She said she would reach out and wanted me to be honest about my thoughts. I thanked her and told her I'd follow up by email. She walked me back to the foyer, gave me a warm, reassuring hug, and then unlocked the door. Before opening it fully, she made sure to step out of sight, mindful of neighbors and appearances. It had been a deeply interesting experience. While I'd had a relationship years earlier, this felt like the closest thing to real intimacy I'd shared with a woman in a long time. Not physical intimacy, but emotional closeness. I don't believe intimacy requires physical acts. Sometimes it's about openness and trust. I had shown parts of myself I usually keep hidden, and taken risks I never thought I would. I'd placed myself in situations that required a great deal of trust, and somehow I'd made it through my fears. A few days later, we exchanged thoughtful emails. She sent me the photos she had taken, which I stored securely on my computer. I enjoyed the experience enough that I returned a few weeks later. During that second session, I opened up even more emotionally. I'd practiced walking with more confidence and put together a coordinated outfit beforehand, including a pair of low-heeled boots. Leading up to it, I'd struggled with sizing and matching clothes. But she firmly pushed me to stop doubting myself and pointed me toward resources to figure things out. That time I also tried subtle shaping garments to enhance my silhouette, and she casually mentioned that we might eventually incorporate more structured pieces. The second session was just as meaningful, though it focused less on physical elements and more on conversation, posture, and presence. There was some light discipline, but nothing intense, and less time spent on getting dressed. There was also a moment where I again placed a great deal of trust in her, when she guided me through a brief sensory exercise involving limited movement and reduced awareness. Surprisingly, instead of panicking, I found myself calmer than expected, focused inward rather than afraid. She took a few more photos, and we spent time talking and sharing ideas. Once again, she suggested shopping together someday. She even encouraged me to paint my toenails, though that was a step I wasn't ready to take, and she accepted that without pushing. It was another powerful experience, one that taught me more about myself. I can't help but wish I could have a relationship where I could share these sides of myself openly, where trust, guidance, and acceptance are part of the bond, because it's something I genuinely value. Don't forget to join me on Patreon for exclusive content. Music.